My name is Emily, I'm 30 years old, and I live in Seattle, Washington. I have always believed that every woman has her own secrets, hidden not out of guilt but out of fear. Me too. But the scariest thing is when the secret is no longer in our hands. That moment when I turned around and saw my mother-in-law standing there, her eyes frozen as if everything inside her had just shattered. I knew that everything was over. Without her having to say anything, I understood that I had lost the most important thing, trust. She did not shout. She did not scold. She just looked at me with eyes full of disappointment and then quietly turned away. Her slow but heavy steps seemed to crush me under an endless weight of regret. I wanted to run to her to explain, to beg her not to say it. But I knew that some things once exposed could never be hidden again. From that moment on, I understood that this family, this marriage had truly fallen apart. On the outside, my life is probably the dream of many women. I have a perfect husband, Daniel. A successful, handsome man who loves his wife. We live with his parents in a small but cozy villa. Anyone who looks at us thinks we are a happy, harmonious couple with nothing to worry about. But does anyone truly understand what a marriage is like behind closed doors? How could outsiders know the things I have to hide, the disappointments I cannot speak of? Daniel is an ideal husband, at least by the standards most women desire. He earns a lot of money, has status, and is always thoughtful and attentive. He has never let me down over trivial matters. If you only look at those things, perhaps I should be the happiest woman alive. But there was one thing he couldn't do, one thing so important to me that it weighed down our marriage. Daniel wasn't good at sex. First, I thought it wasn't that important. Love, care, and a peaceful marriage should be enough to compensate for it. I convinced myself of this during the first years of our marriage. But over time my disappointment grew, like a small crack in a pane of glass. Day by day, it widened silently until the glass could no longer hold and shattered. I couldn't tell anyone. Not even Daniel. How could I say that I wasn't satisfied? How could I complain without hurting him? During the day, I was still the perfect wife, the good daughter-in-law, the woman everyone thought had it all. But at night, when it was just me and my own thoughts, I felt terribly empty. I tried to distract myself. I took yoga classes, learned to cook, even threw myself into work to keep my mind off the void in my marriage. But the more I tried to fill it, the more I realized it was a futile escape. And then one day I made a mistake. I don't know what led me to that moment. Maybe it was loneliness, a long-suppressed desire, or simply a moment of uncontrollable weakness. I had always thought I could hide my emptiness forever, that I could continue living in this marriage without anyone discovering my secret desires. But people are not machines. Emotions cannot be imprisoned forever. And in the end, I let it explode. That day, the weather was unbearably hot. The house was eerily quiet. I was alone. After finishing the chores, I lay down on the bed, exhausted, letting the soft breeze from the window brush against my skin. But it wasn't enough to dispel the strange, restless feeling inside me. I must have dozed off without realizing it. I didn't hear any sound signaling Daniel's return. Suddenly, a cool sensation brushed against my skin, startling me awake. I opened my eyes, but before I could regain my senses, a soft blanket fell over me, blocking my vision. A familiar breath pressed against my ear, the scent of his body enveloping me. I didn't need to look. I knew it was Daniel. When had he come back? Why was he acting like this without saying anything? I felt strong hands running down my body slowly but firmly. A shiver ran down my spine. Those fingers traced every line of my skin, awakening every sense I thought had been asleep for so long. The feeling was strange but intoxicating. I had never seen Daniel like this. Since we got married, our sex life had always been bland, full of gaps that could never be filled. But tonight, everything was different. Daniel was no longer clumsy, no longer hesitant like before. He was proactive, intense, giving me moments I had longed for. I didn't know how much time had passed, only that I had fallen into an unprecedented ecstasy. I held on to him, accepting everything he had to offer. At that moment, I couldn't think of anything else but the satisfaction flooding every cell in my body. And then when it was all over, he slowly stood up. My breathing was still ragged. My heartbeat was still unsteady. I lay there for a moment, enjoying the lingering echoes of pleasure. But then suddenly I realized, the blanket was still covering my head. I reached up to pull it down, and the sight before me made my blood freeze. I pulled the blanket off, my breathing still uneven from the ecstasy. But when I raised my head, my entire body turned to stone. It wasn't Daniel standing in front of me. It was my father-in-law. He stood there, in the dim light of the late afternoon, his expression unreadable. His eyes looked at me, not angry, not confused, just empty. I felt the blood drain from my body. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I grabbed the edge of the blanket, pulling it up to cover my naked body, as if the thin fabric could protect me from this terrible reality. I didn't want to believe what had just happened, but it was all too clear. The man who had just given me the intense pleasure I had craved for so long wasn't my husband. It was him. The pleasure I had just experienced suddenly turned into horror. It felt as if a cold wave had swept through my entire body, making me tremble. I wanted to scream, to ask him why, to deny it all. But my throat was dry. I was unable to make a sound. My father-in-law didn't say anything. He showed no remorse, no hesitation, just stood there, his eyes locked onto me as if engraving this moment into his memory. Then, without a word, he turned and slowly walked out of the room. The door closed softly, leaving me alone in the large empty space. I held my head as a wave of dizziness crashed over me. Everything had happened so fast, so unexpectedly. How could I have let this happen? How could I not have noticed from the beginning? But what terrified me the most wasn't the guilt. It was something else, a thrill creeping up on me. I shook my head, trying to clear it away. No, I couldn't possibly be feeling like this. This was wrong, unacceptable. I should be disgusted. I should be horrified. But why deep inside was there still a lingering feeling of pleasure? My hand unconsciously touched my skin where I could still feel his warmth. My heartbeat was still unstable, not just from panic but also from something else. I closed my eyes, trying to breathe deeply. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the terrifying realization that, for the first time in many years, I felt truly alive. And that scared me more than anything else. Avoidance. I thought that if I ignored it, if I pretended it had never happened, everything could go back to normal. But I was wrong. From that day on, I tried to avoid my father-in-law at all costs. I no longer dared to look him in the eye. No longer talked comfortably like before. I kept my distance in every possible way, using the excuse of being busy to avoid face-to-face interactions. Every time he entered the living room, I would stand up and leave. At family meals, I kept my head down, pretending to focus on my food, just to avoid looking at him. I didn't dare tell Daniel. Just imagining him knowing made me shudder. If he knew, this family would fall apart. Not only would my marriage crumble, but his respect for his father would be destroyed. I couldn't let that happen. But my silence, my weakness, only made things spiral out of control. The breaking point. That afternoon in the quiet house when it was just me and him, I knew. I couldn't run away any longer. I was standing in the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of cold water to escape the oppressive summer heat. Then, a deep voice behind me sent a chill down my spine. Emily. My hand froze. The glass of water in my grip suddenly felt colder than before. I didn't turn around, but I knew he was standing very close. His breath was gentle against the back of my neck. A sensation both familiar and dangerous. We need to talk. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. There's nothing to talk about. I set the glass down and turned, intending to walk out. But just as I reached the door, a strong hand grabbed my wrist, stopping me. The warmth of his touch seeped into my skin, making me shiver. Why are you avoiding me? His voice was deep, slow, but heavy. I clenched my fists, unable to answer. I wanted to escape, but something inside me hesitated. My heart pounded, not just from fear, but from something else. His eyes searched mine, as if seeing straight into the chaos in my mind. And then, like a string stretched to its limit, everything snapped. I don't remember exactly what led to that moment. All I knew was that when I came back to my senses, I was caught in a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't resist. The limits I had sworn never to cross shattered. The space around us blurred, leaving only him. His warmth. The unspoken, invisible bond pulling me in. I knew this was wrong. I knew that if someone found out, everything would fall apart. But my reason was not strong enough to stop me. The point of no return. I don't know how much time had passed. I only knew that when it was over I was lying there, sweat soaking my skin, my breathing still unstable. I felt exhausted, but also satisfied. He looked at me for a long moment. His eyes showed no regret, no hesitation. Slowly he stood up, adjusted his shirt and walked away, without saying a single word. I lay there staring up at the ceiling. My mind was blank. I should feel guilty. I should be horrified by myself. But as I lay there breathing heavily, I realized something even more terrifying. I had no regrets. I had gone too far. And deep down I knew this wouldn't be the last time. There were only the two of us in the house. Everything felt like a smoldering fire, waiting for a single spark to erupt. And then the second time happened. Then the third. Just like that, we rushed into each other, unable to stop. I didn't know what kind of person I had become. During the day, I was still Daniel's gentle wife, the obedient daughter-in-law in my mother-in-law's eyes. But when night fell, when the doors closed, I became someone else. A woman ruled by emotions she could no longer control. Each time I told myself, this is the last time. But I couldn't stop. The worst moment. And then the most unwanted thing happened. That day it rained. A sudden heavy rain in the middle of a scorching summer afternoon. My mother-in-law mentioned she was going out to buy ingredients for dinner. Daniel was still at work as always. I thought it was just my father-in-law and me left in the house. A familiar space. A familiar scenario. One I didn't want but couldn't refuse. I couldn't control myself. I don't know exactly how it started. All I knew was that by the time I came back to my senses, we had crossed the line again. But this time, there was another pair of eyes watching. I raised my head, my breathing still erratic, and I saw her. My mother-in-law. She stood at the door. She didn't scream. She didn't throw things like in the dramatic movies I had seen. She just stood there. Her eyes wide open, her hands trembling as she clutched a grocery bag. We were all frozen. I felt my body turn cold. A sharp, suffocating panic clawed at my chest. Cold sweat ran down my spine. I wanted to stand up, to explain, to say something. But what excuse could possibly change the truth? My father-in-law was silent too. I turned to look at him. His face dark, his lips pressed together as if he were calculating how to handle the situation. But his silence meant nothing. My mother-in-law blinked, as if still unable to comprehend what she had seen. Then, without a word, she turned and walked away. Her footsteps echoed in the hallway. Each step felt like a knife stabbing into my mind. I sat there, my heart pounding so violently I thought I might pass out. I knew, from this moment on, it was over. There was no turning back. No undoing what had been done. I didn't know what would happen next. Would she tell Daniel? Would the family collapse overnight? Or would she stay silent, letting this knowledge eat away at her until it destroyed us all? I didn't know. But I knew one thing for sure. From this moment on I had lost everything. The weight of silence. After that day, the atmosphere in the house became suffocating. My mother-in-law didn't say a single word to me. But her eyes, they no longer held the warmth of a mother. Where there was once kindness, there was now cold, silent disgust. She didn't need to speak. Her silence was a verdict. I don't know if she told Daniel. I didn't dare to ask. I lived in fear. In obsession. Every day when Daniel came home from work, I felt uneasy. Afraid that today would be the day. That he would look at me differently. That he would accuse me. That he would finally ask the one question I couldn't answer. But he never did. Daniel still treated me the same. Still asked me about dinner. Still talked about work. Still smiled when he looked at me. But I knew. Something had changed. And I knew. My time in this house was running out. The end. One evening as I sat in our bedroom, Daniel walked in. He stood in front of me, silent for a few seconds. Then he handed me a stack of papers. Divorce papers. I stared at the words in front of me, feeling the world collapse beneath my feet. I had known this moment would come, but when it actually happened, I still couldn't accept it. You. I opened my mouth but no words came out. Daniel just shook his head. No anger. No blame. Just exhaustion in his eyes. I swallowed hard. You knew, didn't you? He didn't answer. There was only silence between us. I bit my lip, my hands tightening around the edge of the paper. I couldn't justify myself. I couldn't beg. Because I knew. I had no right to. I had destroyed everything. Starting over or trying to. After the divorce I left. I couldn't stay in that city anymore. Every corner, every street, every memory felt like a blade cutting into my soul. I needed distance. A new place. Even though I knew no place in the world could erase my past. I moved to a strange city, rented a small apartment and tried to start over. I found a new job. Tried to blend into my new life. During the day I was busy with work, with new people, with distractions. I told myself, time would help me forget. But when night fell, when I was left alone in the quiet darkness, the past came rushing back. I couldn't forget. I remembered Daniel, the family I had lost, the look in my mother-in-law's eyes, the moment I realized I had gone too far to turn back. And worst of all, I remembered my mistakes. I had given up everything for emotions I couldn't control. I had let myself be consumed by something I should have fought against. And in the end, I was the one who paid the highest price. No family, no husband, no place to call home. Just me, and the ghosts of my past. The final lesson. As time passed, I adjusted. I had a stable job, few new friends, small habits to keep myself sane. Yoga in the mornings, walks in the park, reading at night. But no matter how much I tried, I couldn't erase the past. It was like a scar, a reminder of the price I paid. I write these words not to seek pity, not to ask for forgiveness, but to leave one message. Happiness is not a fleeting emotion. It is a choice. And I chose wrong. I hope you won't make the same mistake.